This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. This week, now this has been my period of the summer of 2022 where I'm dealing more with, I've been taking special requests because some of my original podcast schedule did not really work out too well in terms of being able to find material, which I've already discussed in various places, so I won't go into that long explanation here. But this particular podcast for this week is not actually a request, but it is something that comes out of the research I was doing when I was in Ireland. I had been on the west coast of Ireland with a man called Michael Conneely, who does really wonderful Western sacred tours of Western Ireland. He's been doing that for quite a long time, and had introduced me to several spots, including particularly the Moytura battlefield, where the Tuatha De Danann defeat the Fomorians, the place called the Bed of the Couple, where the Morrigan and the Dagda mate before this battle. And and then when we were visiting another stone circle, or another kind of Iron Age site that wasn't really, they were still trying to sort out, the history behind it. He had told me the story of Corra, and that is what our subject is going to be today. Now, Corra, I'm surprised I had not heard of Corra before, but Corra, Corra, who's usually is the way her name is spelled, and she's also known as Cuireanach. Okay, that's another name that you will see for Corra. And Corra is this serpent monster woman who is actually battles St. Patrick, swallows him, and that he has to cut his way out of in order to, and then he ends up banishing her. They say he gets banished to Lough Derg, which if anybody is follows St. Patrick, or follows, has done Patrick pilgrimages, or knows of Croagh Patrick, which is the nearby supposed holy mountain. Well, it is a holy mountain. It was a holy mountain long before St. Patrick. But they'll know that there's a time called Reek Sunday. And I believe, actually, I'm recording this early August. It was probably last weekend. It's usually the last weekend in July. And there's people make pilgrimages there, and they go, there's like a pure Isle of Purgatory. There's these things that are there for penance and fasting and that sort of thing. And there is a nearby place called, at the bottom of Croagh Patrick, and I talk about Lough Derg, but it's also referred to as Lough Na Corra. Okay, and that's Lough Na Corra is where where this Corra was supposedly banished and bound to the bottom of the lake. Okay, now I want to tell a couple of different versions of this story. There is a obviously very Christianized version of this story, and that's going to come from a site that I found called emeraldisle.ie. Now, they have a Patreon. They do tell stories and folk tales and ghost stories and things, but it doesn't say who is actually producing them. They're just referred to as Emerald Isle. Whether this is just, somebody remains anonymous, collecting stories, that is the one. The other version I'm going to read from the Goddess Alive website. This was by Cheryl, Stratton, and Lana, Jarvis, who were doing research for a book of their own in Northern Ireland. They also came across the name of Corra, and they put down some of their research here in this site. So those are the two different versions. Now, I'm going to read a little bit from the Goddess Alive site first, just so you can get an idea here about this. It's called Corra, the Serpent Goddess of Ireland, and I'll include the link to this one, just so if you want to check it out for yourself. They talked about how they were doing a recent research trip for their forthcoming book on the goddess in Ireland. They came across this one. They said, it so happens this was a rather special goddess, perhaps a goddess from pre-mythic days of Ireland. Okay, and the fact that Ireland has serpents and has never had serpents, by the way, and this idea of Patrick banishing the serpents, and then there's the story of Corra. It's like, okay, where did these serpents come from? But, okay, so they go on. They say the first clue came to the far west of County Donegal, where we were exploring megalithic sites in the area. One of these was at Croagh Patrick, where 2 standing stones were said to mark either ends of a giant's grave, but are probably the remains of a collapsed portal dolmen. The way that the dolmens were, they're the ones that are constructed with these 2 stones upright, and then usually a flat one across the top is a dolmen. They said the name Croagh Corra interested us as it appears to mean stones of Corra. It turns out that Corra was the name of a great serpent goddess of Ireland that predated Christianity. She says the legend of St. Patrick's arrival in Ireland includes the story of how he drove the serpents from the island. The location for his banishment is traditionally thought to be let me make sure I'm saying this right. Let me find the name. It's thought I had written the pronunciation of this one down, but I guess I didn't. I think it's Clemcomkiel, which is just a few miles up the road from Croagh Corra. Of course, I'm sure my Irish friends will correct me if I have that wrong, which I'm sure I do. Of course, the legend is really a mythopoetic story to explain the quote-unquote triumph of Christianity over the native pagan religion of Ireland, a paganism that was clearly goddess celebrating. Another version of the story has St. Patrick chasing the Corra further north to Lough Derg, which then becomes a great center of Christianity. Now, she mentions that Lough Derg is the site of pilgrimage today, undoubtedly one of the most sacred lake in Ireland for Catholicism. There are several islands in the lake, and on the nearest one to the store, Station Island, a basilica and retreat sanctuary has been built. Catholic pilgrims come here by boat from all over the world for 1- and 3-day retreats. However, in the past, from roughly the 12th to 16th centuries, the more northerly island, Saints Island, was the place of pilgrimage. It was a purgatory center and contained the original priory of the lake. As Michael Dames said, purgatory was, in the first instance, a negation of the pre-Christian earth goddess. The new religion from the Middle East had denounced the feminine all the way from Eve and Genesis to the whore of Babylon and Revelations, while Old Testament railings against the goddess and her many guises permeate the writings spread by a celibate priesthood and came into conflict at every level with native Irish tradition. And it was here that we marked this final confrontation. And she mentions the Irish scholar Mary Condren in her book Serpent and the Goddess, Women, Religion, and Power in Celtic Ireland, that the symbol of the serpent was the one most widely used to represent the goddess of the Near East and to depict or mediate the relationships between goddesses and human culture. Even before the symbol arrived in Ireland, the essence of serpent or goddess religions was to be found. Okay. The image of the serpent, because of its association with life, rejuvenation, fertility, and regeneration, was a symbol of immortality, and as such was opposed by the incoming Christian church with its doctrines of duality and salvation through Christ alone. The goddesses of Ireland, of which there were many, had to be subdued, negated, and minimized, and the greatest threat of them all would have been the serpent goddess, who had to be defeated by their foremost champion, St. Patrick. Thus we have the story of St. Patrick chasing Corra, the serpent, through Northern Ireland to the scene of the final confrontation at Lough Derg. Okay. Now, there's a lot of interesting elements to this. I'm going to read the Christianized version of this. Now, first of all, I should mention that the original story is in something called Betu Poreg, which is the 3-part, or sometimes it's called the Vita Tripartita, which is like the 3-part biography of St. Patrick. Now, I don't know whether this is the same one that I'm familiar with from the Life of St. Patrick by Mirku. It's not. I mean, I've read that. I have a copy of the Life of St. Patrick by Mirku because I had actually taken a course in graduate school on St. Patrick where we read a lot of the primary sources, including the only writings that could probably be legitimately attributed to St. Patrick himself. So the Betu Poreg was written in the 9th century, okay, CE, obviously. And, and there's things in Mirku's account where he talks about it being a certain number of years after the death of Patrick, which would place it in the 9th century. So this may well be an expanded version of his account. I may have an abridged version, I'm not sure, because the account that I have does not mention the Corra story. And it does mention the story of Dare that I had mentioned concerning Macha, although it puts a very different spin on it than I had learned at Navan Fort. So I'm not going to digress into that, though, because that's different. However, Macha, the Morrigan, is going to come up again because there is definitely a connection between her and Corra in terms of, not saying they're the same, but there's definitely a connection in terms of them as feminine powers residing in Ireland and how they were perceived. Okay, so let me read this Emerald Isle version of this story of Corra. And, excuse me, this is referred to as the defeat of the Cailleach. Okay, now the Cailleach, I do have a podcast and probably said Cailleach very wrongly in that particular podcast because my Irish pronunciation was not great. That was one of the older ones I did. But Cailleach is, they call this the Saint and the Dragon, the defeat of the Cailleach. Okay, so now the Cailleach is the hag. Okay, the Cailleach is like a monstrous female figure, and is what is used here to represent the feminine element of, ancient pre-Christian Ireland. So let's have a listen to this story. This story is, it's the way that they tell this story, which is, probably not the original from Bethu Porrig, but the way that it is stylized is in some ways extremely amusing. So I'm just going to read it as they have it, and then we'll deconstruct a little bit. Okay, so the story goes, as St. Patrick traveled across Ireland, spreading Christianity and the light among the pagan tribes, he saw many wonders and defeated many evils, but always more rose up to challenge him. So he took himself to prayer and saw a vision that he should travel to Croagh Patrick, although it was not so known at that time, and spend the Lenten fast and prayer on its summit. When he first set sandaled foot upon the slopes, the evil force that opposed him knew its danger. The old druids called her, okay, let me get this pronunciation right, Cuirhonach, or some say Corra today, whose worship may have been brought here by the sorceress Tuatha De Danann after their wanderings among the Greeks and on the arid plains of Anatolia, where first walked monsters. This is interesting, okay? Not only, just to stop here, not only is there some historicity to the idea of Greeks, I mean, there is some DNA evidence that people from Greece and Turkey in certain areas, and also Spain, had settled in Ireland. There's these different connections about where, certainly where the Neolithic farmers and so forth had come from. The people who had built a lot of the megaliths and the cairns and so forth. And yeah, there does seem to be a connection to that. Those of you who are fans of Hecate will recognize that Anatolia there's also an area around there where there's a Hecate temple as well. Not saying, again, not claiming that this goddess has necessarily anything to do with Hecate, but it's interesting that this is what they're saying. There's some biblical connection to this, which I'll mention in a bit. But okay. Others know her by the name of Cailleach, and the Romans called her Cybele, the Magna Mater, Mother of Gods, who claimed birth and death to herself and the wild things of sharp tooth and claw. Okay. Now, Cybele, one of my very first podcasts, probably like the second one I did, included Cybele. And the Magna Mater. Now, the Cappadocian Ma, they don't mention that here, but yeah, these are the cults. When I talk about the original matriarchy cults that are really bloody, this is what they're referring to, because, Cybele cult, we certainly know, featured things like castration, and Magna Mater cult was certainly around in Rome at around the same time that Christianity was, competing for, the whatever was, the religious, religious favor or religious recognition at that period in time, and, the very early empire period. Okay, but both the cult of Cybele, which was actually Cybele was actually worshipped in Rome, and so same with the Magna Mater, which of course is the Latin name for Great Mother. Now they says the Cailleach was an ancient terror, an antediluvian entity who had cackled and danced through the ponderous forging of the earth, sleeping deep in the nighted caverns and crushing depths, awaiting only the coming of humanity to reawaken and work its mischief. Okay, really nice, tell us what you really think, feeling about the Chthonia here. But moving on. Even some say it was the mother of Satan himself, the serpent and the sign of great mystery to the heathens who built the dolmens from Galway Bay to the farthest eastern shores of the peaceful ocean. For long aeons after her awakening, this mother of demons troubled the children of man, as did her own offspring, being strange demons and monsters, Nephilim, spirits, and gibbering things that lodged in the minds of rulers and led them astray. Okay. So Nephilim. Now, gibbering things that lodged in the minds of rulers. This sounds very much like intermediary spirits, and in this case, it sounds like you'd be referring to daemons or what would later be considered demons. Okay, and I'm assuming I shouldn't assume the gender of the person who's saying this, but I don't know. There's a very masculine feel to it. I could be wrong about that. And Nephilim, of course, are the biblical giants, the offspring of angels and humans, right? Okay, now, continuing. Some demanded worship, the better to corrupt pure hearts, and some simply wrought ruin for the malevolent delight of it. All were plagues and pestilences. Yes, this person really loves the old deities. So when St. Patrick trod on the mountain that she had taken as her palace. Okay, now Corra, of course, is obviously seen as... So Croagh Patrick belongs to Corra, right? It was as the ringing of a clear silver bell in silence. Okay, the bell. Let's think. We're going to put that... make a footnote in your mind about the bell. And she knew fear herself for the first time in her long existence, fear that she might finally be called to account. And well, that the Cailleach might be afraid. Some way to the north of Croagh Patrick was Lough Derg, although it wasn't known as such then, and it was the very place she had slept for so long, her home, in some way, say, a gateway to hell itself. Apparently there's a lot of gateways to hell, and, the other one I know of is associated with the Morrigan, so, these female deities are the gateway to hell. As Patrick prayed with all the fervor, grace, and faith God would grant him, so the Cailleach shook and sent her feared servants, the Sluagh, to slay him. Now, the Sluagh were the wild hunt, who took the souls of all that crossed their path, although some believe they had a particular taste for the living spirits of those who have found true love. That's interesting. And from them, even death itself was no release, for the souls they captured joined them on their hunt, spiraling throughout the lands of Ireland and further abroad on that darkest of nights, Samhain, in the form of a vast flock of black ravens. Okay. Take another symbol here. Twined about with undulating shadows they came, and yet upon closer inspection the great birds looked more like wretched thin shades of their previous selves, with gnarled talons similar to the blackthorn's barbs for hands and feet, and wings of dusty smoke. Okay, so this kind of almost weak and wraith-like version of the of ravens. Now, who do we associate ravens with, right? With the Morrigan. Although Morrigan is also associated with the Cailleach. And so it's just tremendously interesting to see that, these connections between Corra and, the way in which the feminine is sort of grouped together here. So Patrick was untroubled, of course, and prayed to the Lord for help, and help he got. A great wind arose and swept from the top of Croagh Patrick like a mighty net, catching up things seen and unseen, the wild hunt along with it, and in the form of a towering whirlwind carried them out to sea, where they were cast upon the waves, sinking into the depths to bay their fury forevermore amid lost cities which heeded them not, deep in mud. Okay, we see this a lot also in Irish mythology, the idea of, being cast into the sea or cast into the water. When the Tuatha De Danann defeat the Fomorians, the Morrigan recites her spell, and they all go marching into the sea. When Balor's taken down by Lough, when he's the great eye that opens and burns up everything around it. He's when Lough hits it with the slingshot, he also falls into the Lough Arrow, the area of Lough Arrow near Moytura. Okay, so this idea of the quote unquote evil forces, or at least the enemy forces, going into the sea, going into the depths of the sea. Like, the sea has this kind of devouring kind of an image in this sense. The sea as representing, the floodwaters, as it were, that regresses and that takes something back to its original form. So that's rather interesting. Okay. The Cailleach was near caught up herself, but the wily old hag was strong and fought free, being deposited before St. Patrick on top of the mountain. Then she reared up in the shape of a fiery dragon, with breath as hot as the fires that wrought the very mountains. For 2 days and 2 nights they struggled in that place, with prayer and spell, faith and fury, sacred litanies clashing against the curses of wizards from lands long turned to dust, until at last the Cailleach was beaten and toppled from the mountain top to flee with all haste to Lough Derg. Some say he struck her with his black bell to drive her down the slope. Okay. The good saint wasn't going to let she, who had caused the ruin of many, escape herself, so he leapt atop a horse and gave chase. Oh, that's interesting. As she fled, the Cailleach knew that for all his divine favor, Patrick was still only a man, and would grow thirsty from the chase, so she spat her deadly fiery venom into every well and body of water that they passed. Onwards they raced by night and by day, when the demon and the saint and Patrick was almost ready to collapse by the time they had reached Leitrim. He prayed to the Lord to give him a drink, and at that moment his horse stumbled and he fell off, knocking his head on the ground, and where his head touched the soil, a spring appeared. He drank deeply and with gratitude, and as his senses cleared, he knew where the old worm would go. Nowhere else back but to her lair at Lough Derg, so there he went to lay in wait. At last the Cailleach showed up, thinking she'd left Patrick far behind, but he sprang from the top of a rock onto her back as she entered the lake, and battle was joined again. Fierce was the fight, and none can say how long it lasted, but eventually the Cailleach swallowed him whole. Okay, he's in the belly of the beast. Not deterred, Patrick tore his way out of her stomach with the iron-shod point of his crozier, staining the lake waters red. Apparently through all this, he's dressed as a bishop, so just keeping this, think about this. Walking around with your crozier. Which is why the lake is called Lough Derg, or the Red Lake, today. Sorely wounded and weakened, the demon came at him again, but he spoke a word of faith, and she was lifted with such power that when she slammed down, the whole lake was emptied of water, and the land about was inundated for months after. Sounds like a bit of a natural disaster, doesn't it? Sounds more like they've had a drought and then finally had some drowning rains. In any case, to this day, the Cailleach still rides, bound and harmless, as long as the people of Ireland keep their faith and to their prayers. And he goes on to say, but there are those who believe that her spawn still walk the earth, not least the devil himself, and plan to free her so that more of their monstrous kind might be born, and that at certain times of year she can rise to the surface to hiss her futile curses at the sky once again. Okay. And it's and there's a quote here, and it doesn't say where it's from, but in the time of storm, when thunder is rolling and lightning flashing and frightening away the dark night, then the serpent is allowed to rise and take its sport on the surface. And when by any chance man at this time pass by that lonely water, they see the serpent riding the waves like a wild horse with a flowing mane, the froth boiling away from his sides in all its terrible entirety. So, I am not sure where that quote is from. That's just something that they put there. So, okay, there's so much to unpack here in this story. Okay, first of all, we have the idea of the hag. We have the idea of the hag as a flock of ravens. We have the hag as the monstrous beast, a dragon beast, okay? Now, mind you, as we've said, there were never any serpents in Ireland. But it does occur to me that there are serpents in the water. I mean, you do hear about eels. You do hear about these other kinds of things that exist in the water, but not in, not on the land itself. There's another story of St. Colman where he supposedly rescues a girl who is washing clothes in the river. In this it's the same group, this Emerald Isle group, that tells this story. And this girl is washing clothes when all of a sudden one of the serpents comes up and tries to swallow her. And she calls to the holy man for help. And of course he prays to God. And then at the sound of the holy words, the serpent just belches her back up. Which we can obviously see here as the idea of, the Holy Church saving women from this Chtonic kind of a force, right? Which does actually kind of fit in with the theme here. Okay, so let's just look at some of these things. First of all, the idea of, first of all, okay, with all the stories of St. Patrick, they have this kind of martial aspect to them. He's always kind of a warrior, at least in the biopics that are written of him. Okay, there may be other versions that are not quite that way, but it's a very interesting kind of tradition of these Christian stories where the Christian church or the Catholic Church or Jesus himself is seen as a kind of, warrior, like wielding the sword, kind of, Archangel Michael kind of energy. And of course, Archangel Michael is probably, has a planetary connection to Mars and to previous, Babylonian gods that like, Mikal is probably, from another Babylonian deity. There's this warlike, this Ares, Mars kind of aspect to St. Patrick, where now he's going and he's making war. Now, the being swallowed by Corra, being swallowed by the serpent, this is another really common motif. In the Bible, you see the idea of Jonah and the whale. There are a lot of different legends of, different heroes who are swallowed by the monster and have to cut their way out. Okay? Even Eros and Psyche to some degree, which is actually a story about love, is the idea that she takes a knife. She's in this unconscious darkness. She takes the knife and the candle and confronts her husband who's sleeping, but then realizes her husband's the god of love. But there's still the suffering because there's still the attempt to destroy there, even though the actual thing doesn't happen. The symbolism is still there. And this is a type of what they call a Nikia, or it's a descent into the underworld. And, the term Nikia is often used in connection with Homer's Odyssey, because there's a chapter, the chapter in there of Odysseus going with Circe the witch to the underworld to do a necromantic ritual to call up Tiresias, so that Tiresias can explain to him how to get home again. Because Poseidon's making his life difficult and he can't get back to Ithaca. So, so that's the first Nikia, and then of course at the end there's a Deuter Nikia where Hermaeus is leading the souls of the dead suitors who took advantage of Penelope's hospitality to the underworld. So anything having to do with the underworld is called Nikia. Now normally there's a purpose to this journey. There's this kind of wrestling with the underworld, having this struggle with this kind of these chthonic forces, which can be, you can think of them as the forces of darkness, or you can just think of them as, these forces that you don't have control over, that are much more powerful than you, and that you still need to negotiate and somehow incorporate. So it's supposed to be a process of integration. Instead, what we often see in Christian myths, because we also see this in the dragon slayer myths, right? It's the idea of the dragon as, representing some kind of evil that has to be exorcised or gotten rid of. And we see that element here as well. And of course, this element is female and is associated with the ancient female deities of Ireland. Okay, the fact that the ravens show up, I'm like, okay, that's tying Morrigan, that's tying Macha, especially since this seems to start in Northern Ireland where Armagh is, or Ardmacha. Okay. And there's another connection to Ardmacha too, which I'll mention in a moment. But yeah, it very much turns it into the idea that this is an element to be conquered and gotten rid of. It's associated with death. Okay. And yeah, as the person says in that story, the serpent is associated with life and death. And in most cultures, the serpent is positive. If you go to India, you have the Nagarajas, you have the serpent kings. And it's, and it's revered as a symbol of life. Certainly in India, the idea of Shakti, the idea of the feminine power, is represented as a serpent that goes up your spinal column, right? We see the serpent as representing something positive. However, in Christianity, the biblical idea of the serpent, you always hear about the serpent as being associated with the devil. And it goes back to the Old Testament where Adam and Eve, Eve encounters the serpent. Now, it's the woman who encounters the serpent, right? And then she is, quote unquote, deceived, and her and Adam eat the fruit, and now they see each other as different. And, here's telling, they cover their shame, okay? So, two big things there, okay? One is that life is something that should not have happened. Okay? When they eat that fruit in the garden, life begins. And that should be what the connection is to the serpent. The serpent is the initiator of life. And because the serpent not only represents life and death, but also the power to throw off death, because the skin sheds it, the snake sheds its skin, as Joseph Campbell has said, in the same way that the moon sheds its shadow. It's a symbol of regeneration and rebirth, or the symbol of the Ouroboros, the snake that swallows its own tail. It's the cyclical idea of things. That doesn't fit into the Christian vision, as the first piece I read pointed out. Christian vision this is about salvation through Christ. It's about conquering death, okay? If you ever read James Hillman's Dream in the Underworld, he has a tremendous amount to say about this idea of spirit conquering death. First of all, it's just blatantly not true. But second of all, the kind of psychological damage that kind of idea has to do with. It's the idea that Christ took the underworld journey for you, so nobody has to go to the underworld again. And that's just, there's just so much wrong with that. It's this privileging of what we call spirit over soul. If you listen to my conversation with David Beth in the Chthonia Conversation series, there's a lot of discussion about that particular idea. But yeah, there's this idea that somehow anything connected to the dynamism of life on Earth and living on Earth, that all has to be sacrificed for some kind of transcendental ideal, okay? And this transcendental ideal is not, it's all throughout our culture, and it really doesn't matter whether you consider yourself a Christian or not. That idea pervades a lot of spaces. It even pervades scientific thinking, because when you live in this rational, analytical world, which is that kind of a world, it's very linear, it's very, it's ordered, it's analytical, it has rules. That is, and it's what we would identify with, yes, the masculine with a capital M. It's definitely that way of thinking, even though they're, for scientific atheists, let's say, the theistic piece, the God piece may be taken out, but it doesn't change the basic structure of it and this basic idea of ordering. Now, it's important to note that Corra, the story of Corra sounds suspiciously, first of all, you could point to the book of Revelation, where, the devil is cast down and bound in the lake for 1,000 years. It's very, definitely mirrors that St. John of Patmos Revelation story. It mirrors another story, though, as well, and that is in ancient Greek mythology, the story of Typhon. Okay? When there's a battle between the Titans and the Olympians for supremacy, the way I always teach this tautonomachy, as they call it, is that you're really talking about the forces of order trying to overcome the forces of chaos. Okay? Then these are the forces connected to Gaia, to the earth, the monstrous beings of earth that are, considered to be inimical to rational order. Because even the ones that fight on the side of the Olympians, okay, like the Hecatonkures, the 100-handers that throw their rocks, they're still in Tartarus after all this is said and done. They don't get to just roam the earth. They're put under the earth with everything else. They're just kind of put in charge under the earth, but they're still under the earth. These are all forces that are, in a psychological sense, this would have to do with forces that are sublimated or repressed in the subconscious, right? Which, there's more ways to look at it than that, but that would be that particular interpretation or inflection. And so what happens is Gaia creates, now, I don't know, in some versions, Hera, Zeus's wife, which is very interesting, that's an interesting side digression, create Typhon, and Typhon comes out of death and battles with Zeus, okay? And Zeus is battling away with Typhon using his thunderbolts, like basically scorching the earth and setting it on, and everything's setting it on fire. And very similar to this story as well, where Corra's turning around and scorching or putting her venom in each of the lakes. She's poisoning everything as she goes along, so the whole earth is becoming scorched. And then later it ends up becoming flooded. But she is, but it's that same idea of this monster of chaos that is taken down by, Zeus is the storm god. And of course, if you're a Christian, you believe God the Father is Jehovah, who is also a storm god. And maybe, and now, and then these later versions of Jesus Christ, even though you really don't see evidence of this aspect of Jesus in the Old Testament, or you barely do in most places. Most of his message seems to be about, peace and helping the poor and that kind of stuff. But he's also got this, I think it's only when he banishes the money changers from the temple is that when you see Jesus getting, kind of badass with the whip. But otherwise, he's considered to be a pretty docile kind of a guy. And so to see Patrick taking on, but then later on, in these later depictions, he ends up taking this kind of like, he's the warrior, he's one bringing salvation and has his war against, the evils of hell, which is now at this point, that is the way the Chthonia is viewed, as a kind of a hell. When I visited Owenigit out in Connacht, and it's funny how both of these sites are technically in Connacht. When I went to go visit Owenigit, that's also referred to as the gate to hell. And again, these are ancient sacred sites associated with the other world. The other world is not hell. Okay, the other world is most definitely not hell, but it's portrayed that way because it's connected with the earth. It's connected with the mounds. It's connected with what's under the earth. And this goes back to the whole thesis that I had in Death and the Maiden, that anything that is Chtonic, once salvation theory comes in, the Chtonic becomes demonized, it becomes devalued, and that translates to everything. Translates to our interpretation of, how we view the earth. Part of the reason we have such a problem with climate change is because people seem to think that, the earth is something, again, even the scientifically minded, we somehow think this is something that we correct, that humans, with our eye consciousness, with our, with our intelligence, that somehow we are the keepers of everything, which is a biblical idea. Okay, they create things and Adam is put over them, right? He's made dominant over the beasts of the land and everything. This happens in Genesis. And that idea still, thinks. We think that, we somehow think, either people are going to think that somehow, quote unquote, God is going to fix it, or on the other side, they think that, there's a lot that we can do. And there is some things that we can do. I don't want to make it like we can't. But this power that we give ourselves over nature, because more than likely what will happen if we don't do anything about climate change, okay, is that we will become extinct as a species and the world will continue to go on without us. Maybe a new species will arrive. Who the heck knows? But it's just, the idea that somehow we are set over nature, we dominate nature, okay? And that's definitely conveyed here because Corra represents those forces of nature. Now, the other interesting piece that I have here, in addition to the connection to the Typhon story, okay, which is, and by the way, okay, the Typhon story, that's known as the Gigantomachy, okay, that's the name for it. And it actually appears in a frieze, I believe it's on the Parthenon. I know I've seen it. It's like a frieze of this particular battle of the Olympians, and Zeus in particular killing Typhon. And that is often was used by the Greeks as representing Greek civilization triumphing over, quote unquote, barbarians. Okay? So you can see this idea of dominance here, asserting dominance over the earth. That is definitely a component of this story, however else you want to slice it. Okay, and that this is somehow the epitome of that. Okay, the other thing was St. Patrick's bell. Okay, the bell is very interesting because in some versions, he shoves the bells in her mouth. Other versions, he's basically scaring her away with the sound of his bells. And these bells, very curiously, they're one of three relics that are supposed to belong to St. Patrick. These supposedly ended up at the cathedral at Armagh, which is Ardmacha. Okay? Very interesting that the bells, and supposedly they were blackened from battling with demons, right? Demon crows in particular. And here they are, the bells are being stuck in the cathedral as like kind of a symbol or a barrier against Macha, the same place where there's a story about his horses. Now, again, in the version that I've read of the life of Patrick, this is not mentioned, but a lot of times the horses are considered to be Macha returning to her area, and therefore St. Patrick killing them as a result. So, So and of course the bell, if we think about the symbolism of the bell itself, the bell has to do with, it's often a symbol of awakening, right? The alarm goes off, it's like an alarm bell. Or you think of church bells. that ring at certain times. So the bell tends to have this, or it's a call to order. You ring the bell. You're out at recess. Somebody rings the bell. Everybody lines up. Right. It's a sign of ordering, and of putting things. So again, there's this idea of ringing the bell against the forces of chaos, if you will. So this really this kind of leads us to the way in which we talk about the feminine, generally speaking, in this version of what they call Celtic Christianity or Celtic Catholicism. Because St. Patrick, at the end of all of this, is considered to be... I thought this was interesting. I was reading a story about him where he said he is... when he dies, he is allowed to be the judge of Irish souls. Okay, which hence his position here as the head. And supposedly, there's all these stories about him that try to compare him to Moses and the burning bush and all of this kind of I'm going to call it rubbish. But some people, I'm going to be that person, sitting there, the change my mind table. That's what I kind of feel like about that. But okay. So that particular sacred site's taken over by St. Patrick. It becomes it's Lough Derg, the red, the red lake. But it's also becomes Croagh Patrick. It becomes the holy mountain of St. Patrick. When I was at Navanfort, which is the sacred site of Macha near Armagh, it's all, it annoyed me to look there and to see all the things about Awan Macha. And then it's like, do you want to follow St. Patrick's trail here? And I'm like, no, I don't. That is still there. St. Patrick's church or the cathedral is still there. Because Armagh is the seat of Catholicism throughout all of Ireland, really. I mean, it's one of the, let's just say it's one of the biggest ones. Not the only one, but it's one of the biggest ones. And, that was it. Patrick ended his fast when God gave him the right to judge all the Irish at the Last Judgment and agreed to spare the land of Ireland from final desolation. Oh, how nice. It's this idea that somehow Patrick has taken on this harrowing of hell role and has struggled with the ancient goddess. And what you see at all of these sites, so I mentioned that about Awan Macha, but if you go another site, there's another site it's in Kerry, called the Fort of the Red Claw. And this is now a site of Marian worship. People go up there at the beginning of Beltane, or Beltania, which is the month of May, and they do their rosaries and walk around 9 times. This is all the way in which the Christian feminine ends up replacing what was there originally. Another example is St. Bridget. St. Bridget is supposed to be a great friend of Patrick, and what does she represent? She represents chastity. Okay, I mean, St. Bridget has, some other characteristics which make her interesting and unique among saints. And so people might point to this and might point to Bridget and also to the Virgin Mary as elements of the feminine, the Catholic feminine. Still, it's still present, but it's in that very sanitized form. It's in that virginal form. The sexual element is taken out of it, and that is most certainly represented by the serpent and by these kinds of motifs. And of course, the crow representing the battle fury of the Bav. Which is another aspect of the Morrigan. And I'll remind you about the Irish manuscript. It was a translation of the Bible that was done into the Latin, and it was translated. It was being written by the Irish monks, and there is a version. I'm not remembering what if it was 9th century, if it was around that period of time, or if it was a little older. But nonetheless, this was a version of the Vulgate of Isaiah, and there's that Isaiah 34:14. There's that one point where they talk about the night hag. The satyr shall cry to its fellow, and the night hag shall dwell in the ruins, or something like that. It's something to that effect. And night hag is the Hebrew word is Lilith. It's translated into Latin as Lamia, and in the Scholia, Scholia being notes, okay, annotations of the person who is doing the Irish monk who is putting this in the Latin. By Lamia, there's a kind of little arrow to the side, and there's a note that says Morgana. Okay, so in other words, the Lamia, this night hag, this evil this horrible, evil woman who Lamia, of course, is associated with child stealers, and and I talk about that in my podcast on the Aori, which are the restless dead, particularly the restless female dead. And so Lamia, in this case, is equated with Morgana, which is another, she's the other major force in Ireland, the other major force associated with the land, with the pre-Christian religion and belief system. Okay, so both Corra and Morgana are both regarded as these, Morgan associated more with the ravens and the crows, Corra associated with being the serpent, and the water serpent in particular, the serpent dragon, that represents, again, amazingly, like not only the Typhon story, but also very clear reference to the Revelation story about being bound and harmless, until those who might not pray and fast might release her again. Michael Conneely did tell me he's written a novel in which a group of them get together and release Corra from Lough Na. It's called Lough Na Corra. That's the place. And apparently the church was very angry because rituals for fertility rituals, people who wanted to, make sure they had a baby or, wanted to, bless their marriage or that kind of thing, would go to Lough Na Corra to receive the blessing of Corra long after, the church had banished such a thing. So they would get very, very indignant about people going and invoking these old forces. But it's just, I guess what I want to finish up by saying is that it really was one of the things that really amazed me about Ireland. Ireland's a wonderful, magical place, okay? First of all, I'm not denigrating it in any way. But when it comes to the Catholic element, and there's a lot of Irish who will agree with me on this, by the way. I'm not saying something that's really out of turn there. At least not at this point in their, where they're at in terms of their culture and politics, history, and religion and all that. It's that the Catholicism there is just very, it's kind of, especially the masculine feminine element in it, is meant to be very, very punitive in a way. It's meant to be, for years, you had, I remember doing a paper on this for grad school. There was a real fall off in the population because people, young people were taught to be absolutely terrified of sex. Like this was the devil coming to get you, and you had better not. You look at that woman and that man are looking, or that boy and that girl are looking at each other. You'd better not even think about it because the devil's going to come, and some of the ways in which people were threatened. And then, God forbid, you actually got pregnant out of wedlock. We all know about the thing of the Magdalene laundries, where these girls were just sent and their babies were taken away. There were other versions of that. I've heard that, in some cases, with some families, I suppose if there are families who were not, maybe poor families, they went to the laundries. Others, it would be the girls taken out of school to go take care of a sick auntie, quote unquote, and have her baby, and then the baby's taken away. The priest is always called in to manage the situation. And the kind of the way in which this is handled, and the way in which especially those types of the laundries and the places like that where these quote unquote wayward women were sent, Virgin Mary ends up being used as a symbol of oppression. And it's kind of like the whole idea of, chastity, being thrown in their face, and the evil that they have committed by daring to engage in their sexuality. And this goes kind of back to the problem that I was talking about with Jessica Grota in that podcast on Hetera. The kind of thing I was alluding to, which might have been slightly, that wasn't entirely off topic, but being we were talking about eroticism and erotic core, there's a huge problem with the way that we deal with sensuality and sex. And sex is not all there is to eroticism. I don't want to, that was certainly her point, and that is absolutely true. Eroticism has a lot more to do with just sex. But our attitude towards sex often tends to predicate our attitude towards sensuality in general, because there's this idea that is kind of like slammed down on you that this is from the depths of hell. This is corrupting. This is the worst thing ever, right? And it's interesting how it's always portrayed as a feminine thing. It has to do with those. It's not simply those quote unquote old pagan forces. It's it's the way in which the feminine forces in particular are so dangerous and have to be kept bound and harmless and have to be kept away with prayers and by building churches on top of them and putting statues of the Virgin Mary on top. I mean, they represent all of the dangerous Chthonic elements, and it's astonishing how fearful the fear of the Chthonic that you would see within Ireland. While at the same time, I'm sure there was also an acknowledgement and acceptance of it in another way, particularly when it comes to the way that fairies are perceived in fairy lore. I want to finish just with the story of a place that I've seen a couple of times now in Sligo, because I feel like it kind of sums the idea up. There was in Sligo, there's something called the Abbey Quarter Passage Tomb. And you'll see a sign for it if you're walking down the road, sort of out, along the river. The river, by the way, which is also, the Garavo River, which is actually named for yet another name for the Cailleach. It is Garavo. And so if you walk down that road, you'll see the sign for it. And when you actually find the tomb, it's in the middle of a roundabout in a residential community. You can see the curbstones sticking up around the edge. And in the middle of this roundabout is this massive, ugly cross, plus two, like a Mary and a, Mary figure, and there's another, I don't know if it was two female figures, I can't quite remember. I have a photo of it somewhere. Maybe I'll include the photo in the YouTube version. But there's this, and the story behind this tomb, as I found out, was that it's considered to be a fairy fort, okay, that particular megalithic site. And they were building a development there. They wanted to dig it up. And people said, absolutely not. No way. We're not messing with the fairies there. We don't want that kind of, inequity visited on our houses. No, don't touch it. So it was left in the middle of this roundabout. But the Catholic Church got very angry and said, no, you're going to dig it up and get rid of it. And they're like, no, we're not. They were pushing back on it, saying, no, we're not disturbing that. So the church's solution instead was to put this giant ugly cross and these supposed holy figures in the middle of this, which every time I look at it, I'm just like deeply offended by it. I just like, but I always said that's almost like what's summed up about what's wrong with Catholicism in Ireland in one monument. It's just, it's crazy. And because to me, it's just like, wow, you need to keep those forces are so threatening to you, and St. Patrick fighting with Corra, being swallowed by Corra, and then it becomes about destroying and conquering her. By the way, it's also worth noting that the dragon motif has two different meanings. In China, of course, the dragon tends to be more of a symbol of good luck and good fortune. Okay. And the dragon is jovial, it's see the dragon is laughing, and, it's a very positive and auspicious symbol of abundance. We tend to see it in Western culture as a symbol of greed. Okay. So again, there's that idea of wealth, Pluton, gold, hoarding gold. And where do the dragons hoard their gold? In caves, right? There's a very Chthonic element again, because wealth comes from under the ground. This is why in India, the Nagaraja live in a world underneath the ground where the jewels are so resplendent, it shines brighter than the sun, and the place is actually more beautiful than the upper world, because the precious gems down there shine so brightly. It's the idea of the wealth that comes from the Chthonic. It comes from the earth, but instead now it's demonized as something that is hoarded. Because this idea of the material things that are hoarded in excess. You know what I mean? That this is what the dragon ends up representing. And I needn't get into the symbolism of the virgin being sacrificed to the dragon, symbolism that we also see in these kinds of rites of passage stories. That's a Jungian, kind of a divergent Jungian topic. Jung talks about it in his essay, The Psychological Aspect of the Corre. But this idea of the bloody Earth Mother, and so that essay called The Saint and the Dragon, from that more Christian version of the story, comparing Corra to Cybele and to Magna Mater, I was just like, wow, that's the threatening Chthonic, and that gets me almost back to the idea of castration anxiety, because certainly that was an aspect of these cults, and who knows? I mean, we don't know. It's speculation. That could be one of those reasons that cult was not particularly in favor by men. I don't know. We don't know, but there's definitely this element. We see this kind of a narrative, and we see, of course, the way in this turns into a good and evil narrative, where the Chtonic is evil, and that which represents the church or the celestial or the sky god, Corra sitting there, as they say at the end, cursing the sky. This split between heaven and earth, that instead of being interpreted as the way in which we humans with our consciousness perceive time and space, is perceived as, that's the good place and this is the bad place. So some things to think about there. Again, a lot of this is just my musing and speculation on it, but there's definitely some elements there that are really, really hard to ignore. I want to thank you again for listening. If you've been a regular listener, thank you so much for your listening and support. If you're new to this podcast, please subscribe. If you do it through audio, this podcast is on Spreaker, but you can subscribe through iTunes, Google Play, whatever your podcast, your preferred podcast app is. If you're on YouTube, certainly subscribe and like if you like this video there. And if you are interested in all of my work, please check out Chthonia.net. By the way, somebody pointed out to me today, I was working with somebody, that the Chthonia.net that you look at on your smartphone, for some reason, none of the menus are working. So I'm working on that. That because you only can see the first page of content, which really doesn't tell you anything because it's kind of a front page that, so working on trying to fix that. But Chthonia.net is my website. If you look at it on a regular computer, you'll see there's I have all my classes that I teach. I have my, I have my podcast. The podcasts are there, and also links to them, and also to the publications that I have out. And I'm gonna try to keep that up to date. I'm not great at keeping the blog up to date on there. Where I do keep people up to date a lot is on social media, which is Chthonia Podcast, one word, run together. On Twitter and on Instagram, it's one word. On Facebook, it's two words, Chthonia Podcast. And on YouTube, it is just Chthonia. And if you're interested in supporting my work at all, again, there's patreon.com/Chthonia. If you'd like to become a member, $5 level and above gets extra podcasts every month, extra commentary on the conversations. So there's some extras there for people who are interested in supporting. And of course, I thank all of you. You're all very wonderful and very supportive. And, especially to my patrons who are trying to find other ways for me to expand that audience. I really, really do appreciate that. I'm still, looking out at the wide world and seeing how to, to get the word out a bit more. But, so if you do like this podcast, do spread the word. Thanks again for listening, and till the next episode.